The Big Ten finished with a bang on New Year's Day with Ohio State, Michigan State, and Wisconsin defeating the SEC, plus Baylor. And then, of course, the Buckeyes move on and win the national championship over another great team in Oregon. So what's in store for the Big Ten, possibly getting off to a better start this season than what we thought was disastrous to start the non-conference play in 2014? We bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com to break down three huge matchups for the conference. Joe, thanks so much for joining us as always. Let's start with the Buckeyes taking on Virginia Tech. And who would have thought when Ohio State left the field in Columbus after a 2-touchdown loss against Virginia Tech that they would have run through Wisconsin, Alabama, and Oregon 3 consecutive weeks to win the national championship a few months later. You got Ohio State going to Blacksburg this September, and I think this might be a wake-up call for Ohio State if they're thinking too highly of themselves going into this season, but then they have to right out of the gate face the team that knocked them off last year.
Interesting. It's a very interesting matchup for both sides. I mean, everybody made wind about Ohio State's schedule at the beginning of the year, how it was soft. Well, Ohio State knocked off Alabama. They knocked off Oregon. They faced 12 bowl teams on their schedule, Mark, at the end of the year. So they really ran the table, beat up on some quality competition, and a lot was said about the Ohio State offense making the run, led by Ezekiel Elliott, led by their three-headed monster at quarterback, J.T. Barrett, Cardale Jones, and Braxton Miller, who didn't get any playing time last year. But it was the defense, to me, that really stepped up at the end of the year, made some dominating performances, and that's why they won the national championship last year.
Yeah, and again, Virginia Tech, wow, after that game, they looked so dominant defensively, especially that pass rush, and then they always have those 2 lockdown corners. Big things were expected, and then they turn around, come back home, lose to East Carolina. It was a fairly marginal season, although they finished off strong with a bowl win against Cincinnati. Any thoughts about the Hokies coming in?
About the game, I think when I break it down, when we broke the numbers down, it was interesting. What I found each run last year against Wisconsin, against Alabama, and against Oregon was their ability to hold their opponents on third down, not only creating turnovers against Alabama and Wisconsin, but their ability to maintain their composure on third down. Throughout the year, they always had a solid third down defense, holding opponents to around 34%. Well, against that 3-game stretch, Wisconsin, Alabama, and Oregon, they held those opponents to 9 of, I believe it was 43 on third down conversions, which came at 14% lower than their regular season average. So to me, that was a big reason why Ohio State had success in the playoff. Not just their ability to force teams by time of possession with Ezekiel Elliott rushing the football for over 200 yards per game, but the defense stepping up, getting 3 and outs, and giving the ball back to the offense to allow them to wear down those opposing defenses. And to me, that's the glaring statistic defensively for Ohio State. They finished the year +5 in turnover margin. That's a solid mark. Entering that game against Oregon, they were at +9. They turned the ball over 4 times in that national championship game, but never allowed Oregon to regain that lead late in the third quarter, and they pulled away in the fourth quarter with their offense. When you look at this game against Virginia Tech lost a total of 5 games last year by 20 points total. They have a very active defensive front led by their defensive coordinator, Bud Foster, that had 44 sacks on the year. That's top 10 in the country. Very active, and they're solid in the secondary, and they were opportunistic when they had to be. They still finished the year -3 in turnover margin. Very uncharacteristic of Bud Foster's defense, but they can put a lot of pressure on Cardale Jones or J.T. Barrett or Braxton Miller, whoever decides to start for the Buckeyes in this game. And that's the cause of concern if you're an Ohio State fan going up against the Hokies week #1 in Blacksburg.
If you want to check out an ugly offensive display from 2014, you check out Michigan and Utah, the Wolverines in this game just constantly 3-and-out, 3-and-out, 3-and-out. The defense wasn't bad last year. We assume that the Michigan defense was down, or a lot of people do, because they went 5-7. The defense was really good. They only lost a couple players from that team, so I expect the Wolverines defensively to be strong. The offense atrocious. They've not been able to run block the last few years. No dynamic playmakers on the outside. And, of course, Devin Gardner gave it up way too many times. Taking on a Utah team that ran the gamut in the Pac-12 and looked extremely impressive doing it in what could be argued as possibly the best division in college football, the Pac-12 South. So set us up for Michigan, this time going out to Utah.
Well, they lost that ball game 26-10 last year in the Big House. You mentioned the offensive woes that plagued the Wolverines. Wasn't just Devin Gardner's inability to stretch the field. It was turnovers, Mark. Michigan was minus 16 overall in turnover margin. That was ranked 121st out of 128 teams in college football. One of the worst turnover margins in the country. Can't win ball games when you're turning the ball over 3 or 4 times a game. So that's offensively where Michigan's woes were. When you look at the defense, though, overall, Mark, Jim Harbaugh has a defense that only gave up 311 total yards per game. That's a top 15 statistical defense. So if you could turn it around from an offensive perspective, ball security, have a disciplined offense, I think Michigan will have a successful season on top of last year's dismal 5-7 performance. They're going to be going up against a very opportunistic team in Utah. This is a team that led the nation with 55 sacks overall. They had a very active defensive front led by their leader, Nate Orchard, who had a school record 18.5 sacks on the year. He leaves to the NFL, so they're going to have to make up that defensive production for the Utes. Now, people think that Utah plays much better at home than they do on the road. Well, last year they only were 3-3 at home. They played much better on the road with a 6-1 mark. When you look at turnovers, this is a team that feasted off of turnovers. They were +9 in turnover margin overall. Very opportunistic defense. So we're going to have to see how this offense plays out for the Utah Utes and Kyle Whittingham. But statistically, play much better on the road last year than they did at home. And then that has to be a cause of concern if you're a Utah fan. Couple the fact with Nate Orchard's departure from that team-leading sack total, that's a cause of concern going up against Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan offense week number 1 of the season.
If you want to check out a rugged schedule, look at BYU. They've got some killer games week to week. Of course, they're in a very unique position, not playing in a conference. They're not Notre Dame, but they want to see themselves as a Power 5 type program, and they definitely play on that level. Very difficult schedule. Included in that is Nebraska, not under Bo Pelini, but again, under Mike Riley, who, of course, comes from Oregon State. And this may be his last chance to make a real big mark on the college football stage as he's into his 60s. Nebraska taking on BYU in this one.
Interesting. You brought up BYU. In my opinion, the hardest schedule in college football this year. They have Michigan. They have Nebraska. They have UCLA. They have Boise State. They have Fresno State. They have Utah State. So very difficult. This year, they have an outside chance to be a playoff buster. Let's look at their performance in 2014. They started very fast, 4-0, led by their quarterback, Taysom Hill, who early part of the season. They beat up on opponents in their first 4 games with a winning percentage of 420. So they beat up on sub-500 competition. Taysom Hill went down against Utah State. The team proceeded to lose 4 straight. The combined winning percentage of those 4 opponents in their 4 defeats were 703. So they lost to the better teams on their schedule with quarterback Christian Stewart. When Christian Stewart got acclimated, they beat up again on the weak part of their schedule. They had a 4-game run at the end of last year against a combined win total of 262. So they beat up on sub-500 teams to give them 8 victories.
Believe that we lost Joe there, wrapping up the BYU Nebraska summary and preview of that game. We looked at Ohio State taking on Virginia Tech and, of course, Utah and Michigan. Joe Lisi from GoForThe2.com. Check out his articles there. Again, he has knocked out analysis and previews for some of the best non-conference matchups in college football heading into 2015. And we'll catch you next time, of course, right here on Mark Rogers TV.